Stu is the Director of Strategic Assets at Birds Canada. We invited Stu here as an expert on birds, migration ecology, and collective data management, who has made tremendous contributions to collaborative movement data collection and sharing through the creation of the Motus wildlife tracking system, among other achievements. Really looking forward to your talk. Do you want to take it away?
Yeah, thank you very much. Just want to confirm you guys can see my presentation properly?
We can, yep.
Okay, great. I'm just gonna get the chat going so I can see all your faces, all 9 of you anyway. So it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation and involvement in this series. May is a little bit crazy for us, and I wish I was paying more attention to some of the previous ones, but I'm looking forward to joining in on the next one, like in this series. And my talk right now, realize we're talking about data sharing and archiving. I'm going to touch kind of more on a little bit of everything that's being covered in this series: data collection, analysis to some extent, and the data sharing and archiving at a high level, partially because all of what we're talking about, data sharing and archiving, is integrated into Motus and not an afterthought. And I think it provides an interesting case study of how that can kind of be integrated into a system. It doesn't work for all movement ecology, but it's an interesting case study. So the going title of my talk is Mobilizing Motus, so maximizing the efficacy for conservation science, which is really what we're all talking about. So come on, just to preface, Motus is a program of Birds Canada, which is a nonprofit charitable organization in Canada dedicated to bird conservation. And together we're Canada's voice for birds, but not just birds move around, so it's not just about Canada. And I wanted to, from the tracking for migratory animals perspective anyway, and probably the same thing rings true with other technologies, is that they're all complementary. Quite often they're sort of shed in the light of being competitive, but I'd like to sort of try and squash that as much as possible. They all provide their pros and cons and their own little nuances, and Motus uses a twist on traditional radio-telemetry, and we would call it collaborative automated radio-telemetry. And the concept is that we have automated receivers across the landscape. The devices we use are the smallest available for the widest ranges of animals. So the tags are down to less than 0.2 grams, which allows us to tag just about everything. Well, everything, big insects, birds, bats. Each station has relatively long detection ranges, very high temporal precision, relatively high geographic precision. There's no need to recapture the animals. And as we get more into the topic here, centralized data management and multiple technology and delivery partners, including all of the project partners. Now, why the methods are important, you'll see a little bit later. How Motus works is that these radio tags are put on, in this case, a red knot or a bat or an insect. Stations around the world collect information from those tags, and all the data is piped back to the central Motus database and then distributed to partners and made available to the public. So it sounds simple, but how this is just kind of a more in-depth view of the same. We have projects and collaborators that are all doing their independent projects, but in the background, they're all coordinated and collaborating whether they like it or not. It's ingrained in the system. Their animals fly around the world, are detected by stations, all that data comes back to Motus Central, and from there, we can make it available to the public through a public interface, process aspects of the data for education and outreach activities, ensure background pipelines to nature counts, which is our sort of biodiversity data set at Birds Canada, archive Movebank as well where appropriate, and nature counts is also part of the avian knowledge network. And I'm out of place to talk about background connections to GBIF, but it's all being designed in that fashion where it can all speak together, although we still have a lot of work in terms of integrating it with Movebank and integrating the data sets with GBIF, but the intention is there, and that's the starting point. So when you combine all these data from multiple projects, across multiple stations. You get some pretty remarkable data at a variety of scales. And this animation just shows the fall migration of Swainson's thrushes from Ontario, and then a return spring migration of thrushes leaving Columbia. And it ties Motus into and defines Motus as a collaborative international network of radio-telemetry projects that undertake research and education on the ecology and conservation of migratory animals. Infographics available on the website, or will be soon. Just sort of dives into more detail. I'm not going to go through it, about various scales where we can apply the technology at the local level, at a regional level. And as the distribution of stations increases, you can start to get this hemispheric or global perspective. And even though the tracks here are generalized, they're a representation of actual tracks from a variety of species, and I'll talk about that later. I'm going to gloss over the infrastructure and technology, but it's an important part of the data collaboration and the sharing. Is it all starts like at the tag and receiver level, and then has to permeate through the entire system. It's nothing we can't do it at the end and backtrack. We have to keep that sort of train of thought going through the entire process from the time the tag is deployed. And there's a spirit of openness within Motus and sharing. So there's 3 different receiver types. 2 are commercial and 1 is open source. But all the data is being collected in the same fashion, or at least complementary, so that it can all streamline into the Motus database behind the scenes. And I'll just leave the slide so that people watching later can go back and like take a look. And then just for reference, the tags range in size from, as I said, less than 0.2 grams all the way up to 3 grams. And the length of time that those tags exist varies. And then there's also solar and hybrid tags, which have virtually unlimited life. And that lifespan can be incredibly important for managing the background metadata, which is sort of the keeps Motus tied together. Then we have the on-the-ground station deployments, which are in some places grids or strategic fence lines. And as you piece that together, you start to get a global network. Now this, obviously we have the distribution is biased into Eastern North America and North America generally in the Western Hemisphere, but there's a burgeoning network going in Europe and other locations. And this map I made just a few months ago, and then I looked at the map again today. I can't keep up. It's a subtle difference, but Western North America is filling in I can't keep up, and California is absolutely on fire. So it's really exciting to see this growing. And what's really valuable about Motus is that it's the altruistic approach where everybody's sort of feeding on top of each other, rather than it being a centralized strategy for national rollout. And I'm going to gloss over a bit in the interest of time. So from a scribble on a whiteboard at Western University, it's now grown into a global collaborative of over 1,300 stations across 31 countries. And the data consists of 32,000 tags of about almost 300 species, and that's resulted in about 4 billion detections in the system, which is quite a lot. And that has been driven by 500 projects with over 1,400 collaborators. And almost at our 150th publication. I suspect the 150th one's in my email. It's just, I haven't caught up with that yet. So when you pool all these data together, this is a little dated and obviously Eastern North America biased. You get quite a remarkable web of pathways and movements and priorities and places to focus. It's also somewhat biased based on the station position, but there are ways to deal with that. And I probably said it 3 or 4 times before, but it's all driven by the collaborators and the projects, and everybody agrees holistically to this altruistic framework from the outset. So by registering a station or a tag with Motus, you're agreeing to the terms of the collaboration policy, which I'll get to in a little bit. Much of the on-the-ground work is managed by regional coordination and leadership, sort of these on-the-ground champions and this network around the world that is overseeing the deployment of stations. All of the metadata is centrally managed, so each project has their own project page. They can manage and add all of their collaborators, the institutions, manage their citations, so each project has an individual citation that if people access the data, they can cite it appropriately. And then each project page has details on what's being tracked and where, and also station deployment details. That's just different Explore tools that'll be released soon, just to give you an example of the types of data that's available. And this is all publicly available. The whole point, Motus, is that if you want data from your station, you need to give data from your station. There's no halfway. And we're also putting into schools. So there's about Motus stations on 20 or 30 different schools and nature centers, and they have that direct access to the data that's being collected at their station. So what species are flying over and when, and different mutations, as well as case studies about species that they may encounter at their sites. The value-added conservation, like this services that we're hoping to integrate with Motus, is to make aspects of the data that is publicly available into some larger scale hemispheric conservation efforts that are underway. One is the Migratory Bird Initiative being overseen by Audubon. Another example is an Atlas of Migratory Connectivity being done by the Smithsonian and Georgetown University. And that just allows all contributors to Motus to contribute to these higher level endeavors without having to be directly involved. It just all is piped, and they have that sort of higher level order beyond level of their projects. So the why is why Motus, or why that model. It's this sort of wonderful combination of a traditional community and citizen science. It's a positive feedback loop. So the more data you collect, the more stations you have, the better the data is, and it just keeps cycling. And all of the metadata and detection data is shared openly, at least at a high level, not the detection data. You can't go on the website and download data that you would need to publish a paper, but you can go on the website and view all the movements and sort of see it at the highest level. And we have various different permissions in place in the background that allow all the collaborators to specify at what level they want their data to be available. But the general buy-in from day one is that the basic public data is open and freely available, and there's no choice in that matter. As I said, you have to, if you want data from other stations, you have to give data from yours. And then all of the data is permanently archived in the Motus database. So the collaboration policy is intended to maximize the efficacy of Motus data for science, conservation, and wildlife resource management. As I mentioned before, by registering a receiver or tag, Motus collaborators agree with the terms of the policy. We're pushing towards open data as much as possible, and some of that data is open by default. So that includes tag metadata. So what species the bird was on and the date of deployment and where it was deployed. All the information from a station is open, and summary tag detection. So the tag moved from point A to point B is open data, but the details underpinning that, like the exact timestamps, is not. So a researcher can't go in and push the data per se, but can view it and share results for various purposes. Currently, the data access is only available for the registered collaborators for those projects, but we're working on ways to make the data available across projects, as one of our speakers mentioned earlier. Particularly following that GBIF model is very inspiring with custom DOIs across projects, but as Abby would say, that's not too easy. So that's what we want to do, but we're not quite there yet. Lastly, I don't know where my time is, so feel free to cut me off at any time, but I'm wrapping up. And I glossed over a bit. All the Motus data is centralized through an R package. There's tools and guidelines for sharing how the data is visualized, cleaned, and analyzed within that package, and constantly looking for improvements and different things there. As I mentioned, all of the data that I can share, I glossed over examples and I didn't really show that, but it's all available on the website. You can look up any species or station and view it all. All the publications, most to date, are collaborator driven, so within each project, but there's lots of opportunity for cross project analysis and meta-analysis, and some of that is underway. I mentioned augmented data projects, and I mentioned the cross-project data citation management that I hope we'll implement soon. And another underpinning issue is safeguards for sensitive species. So we do have the ability to make private projects or make certain data private, but from our perspective, that's kind of a last resort, because it's counterintuitive to the whole model, but there is in particular species or areas where you don't want to share that data. So all that's sort of covered. So I apologize for rushing. I don't know if I did the 10 minutes or not, but I can elaborate as much as needed in the question period. And you can learn more at any of these locations here, and a bunch of my more generic presentations that talk about the results and how it works are available on the website or elsewhere as well. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to what we can achieve.
Gee, that was wonderful. You, my first question kind of speaks to the future. What's your vision for Motus? Like, where do you think it's like? Where could it go? It's focused on birds right now, but is there opportunity? And this speaks to one of the questions that popped up in our registration, which was, what are the opportunities for collaboration between terrestrial and aquatic movement ecologists in terms of data sharing and archiving? And what barriers are there? I wondered if you could speak to that, because you're focused on birds right now.
Yeah, the limitation of the technology is such that it's pretty much a volant species, a flying animal system, and at least the way it's designed. So it's best for birds that are aloft. And that's just how you get the best detection distances, and you can get that sort of constant feed off the tags, which can give you behavioral information. The concept is sound for other types of tracking, but as soon as you get into bigger animals, satellite telemetry becomes more appealing, and there's other technologies that do a better job. So Motus's niche is more the smallest of the small that you can't put a satellite tag on, and it may be years before we get there. There's similar, it's analogous to the ocean tracking network in the oceans for sharks and fish.
Yeah.
But there, as of yet, not much cross-pollination, although we're putting Motus stations in the ocean, it doesn't work the other way around. And the future is, well, there's a lot of directions it could go. Keeping up with the technology is one of the greatest challenges, but with the advent of global cellular and Wi-Fi networks, it makes it much more easy for stations to talk to tags and for tags to talk to stations. It's not far off to turn every cell phone into a receiver device. It's not far off to turn everybody's computer into a receiver. So, with the right level of investment, you can take our network of 1,400 stations and blow it up considerably. But I'm getting more into like pipe dream type stuff, but it's all conceivable and possible with the right investments. And the concept from our perspective is really just sort of the ultimate ground-based system for tracking animals, and at least the smallest animal. And so sorry, I rambled a bit, but
no, I mean, pipe dreams are kind of the part of what we want to hear about here. So it's very, and our speakers have the best view on what those possibly could be. So we're really curious to hear about them. Speaking of funding, David Savage, I think your question kind of fits in there. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so you have all these different independent groups that are putting up their own receivers. I'm just wondering, like, what kind of funding sources are they using to get those things up and running?
Yeah. I'm going to address one of the things that Stephanie mentioned first, and then I'll hop to your question. And that is the focus on birds, but that's just kind of the function of birds being an attractive funding source, and they move farther. But there is an active group on bats, and bats is actually pushing the expansion in a lot of regions, because like, we think we know nothing about birds. We know zilch about bats. So there's a great opportunity for Motus for bats, and then insects as well. But unfortunately, there's just fewer insects that are big enough. But we can put them on wasps and bumblebees, so we're getting pretty small. One of the great things about Motus is that it is modular, so people can join in at any level. So at the station level, you're looking at 4 to 10K per station. So quite often that funding is part of large research grants, but often it's just an Audubon Society or a private donor or a nature center that can cobble enough money together. You set up a station and you're part of the network and you're collecting data for everybody. So there's those models that are more passive station based, and then there's the models that are very active where there's tagging projects deploying stations. So I don't know if that answered your question about the funding, but it is accessible at sort of many of those levels. So it's hard to pinpoint one source for a lot of this stuff.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to ask all of the speakers to join us back in and move us into kind of a discussion, more of a discussion mode. Though, Stu, if you have a second, I'd have a little look back through the chat as well and see what people are dropping in.